Helen Clay Frick was born in Pittsburgh, entering a household where beauty was expected to forgive almost any practical cost. As long as the business ledgers were balanced and the velvet curtains kept out the noise of the nearby steel mills, the family's world felt secure. She arrived at Clayton, the family home, on September 3, 1888. This family expected power, collected masterful paintings, and desperately tried to avoid talking about death or grief. Helen would grow up to become one of the wealthiest unmarried women in the United States. When her father, Henry Clay Frick, died in 1919, she inherited approximately $38 million. This sum represented well over $400 million in present-day value, yet her life did not follow the script typically assigned to a great American heiress. There was no aristocratic marriage, no famous or politically powerful husband, and no glittering children to marry into the European elite. Instead, she devoted her life to something else, the management of her father's name and legacy. Her existence became a long, deliberate campaign to control how Henry Clay Frick would be remembered. Through this disciplined control over his memory, she defined her own powerful place in the history of American old money. Official histories have long presented Henry Clay Frick as the dominant figure, the steel magnate, the partner of Andrew Carnegie, and the collector whose art became the Frick Collection in New York. In that familiar story, Helen often appeared as a secondary figure, a dutiful daughter, or an eccentric guardian of art and gardens. Archival research, however, reveals a far more complex picture of female power dynamics. From her earliest years, Helen was rigorously trained to view money as a tool, memory as a fortress, and high art as both a language and a defensive shield. She entered boardrooms while still a teenager. She advised her father on major acquisitions before most of her peers had even chosen their debutante gowns. Later, she fought fiercely against museum trustees and curators to keep control of the legacy when other heiresses had long since stepped aside. Her story is a rare example of how a single, isolated and unmarried daughter could become the central mechanism of dynastic continuity. Her power came not from marriage alliances or a family title, but through the guardianship of heritage. The environment that shaped Helen Clay Frick was geographically narrow but immense in its influence. Clayton, the family residence in Pittsburgh, sat only a short carriage ride from the noisy industrial mills that generated the Frick fortune. The smoke from the coke ovens and steel plants drifted across the family's perfectly manicured lawns. Coal soot often settled quietly on the imported lace curtains inside the house. The scale of the home was intimate, but the cost of every object was extravagant. Clayton was not a sprawling 70-room palace like those built in Newport, Rhode Island. Yet, every piece of European furniture, every imported fabric, and every painting spoke the undeniable language of wealth and highly cultivated taste. Servants moved along specific, prescribed paths to ensure the family's comfort. Their constant presence confirmed the family's high status, while their required invisibility ensured their employers' privacy. In this constrained environment, Helen's childhood was both luxurious and profoundly limited. She received her entire early education at home under the instruction of a Swiss governess. Her lessons focused on languages, classic literature, and the complex rules of manners, prioritizing these disciplines before any thought of personal independence. Her father's continuously expanding art collection formed a second, unspoken curriculum. Crates containing masterpieces arrived regularly from dealers in New York and across Europe. Conversations about price, composition, and provenance floated through the family drawing rooms. Even as a young child, records show Helen was already critiquing some of her father's selections. This early sign suggested that she would never accept taste as something simply dictated from above. The house was rich in priceless objects, but tragically poor in emotional safety. Tragedy announced itself early and refused to relinquish its hold on the family. Helen's older sister Martha died in childhood after a long, painful illness caused by swallowing a pin. Her younger brother, Henry Jr., died as an infant from encephalitis. Rooms that should have been filled with noise and joyful games became oppressive spaces, heavy with absence and unresolved grief. Then came the Homestead Strike of 1892, followed quickly by a violent assassination attempt on Henry Clay Frick. The abstract industrial conflict over coke and steel was suddenly transformed into something immediate and bloody. An anarchist entered Frick's office, shooting him twice and stabbing him several times. He survived the attack, but the message was chillingly clear. The family itself had become a high-value target. Clayton immediately shifted from being a comfortable home to an intimidating fortress. Security was significantly increased as public anger pressed continuously against the edges of their private comfort. The surviving Frick children learned that their family name attracted not only devotion, but also envy and shocking violence in equal measure. The emotional result was a household environment that later observers would call obsessive mourning. Every single loss was painfully memorialized, and nothing was ever truly released. Adelaide Howard Childs Frick, Helen's mother, was simply overwhelmed by this series of devastating blows. Already inclined toward fragility, she retreated further into deep illness and chronic depression. Descriptions from that time portray her as emotionally absent, often confined to her room, and rarely serving as the active hostess expected of a woman in her prominent social position. Her withdrawal created a profound emotional vacuum inside the central family structure. Someone needed to accompany Henry to important dinners, to listen sympathetically, and to absorb the ceaseless stream of business decisions and art acquisitions that defined his life. Gradually, that demanding role fell entirely to Helen. While still a young girl, she stepped into a position that in most other dynasties belonged to an ambitious sister-in-law, a favoured son, or the wife herself. She became the constant companion, the dedicated listener, and the trusted critic at her formidable father's side. The father-daughter relationship between Helen and Henry Clay Frick became the very engine that powered her life and defined her future. He quite openly designated her as his favourite. The surviving son, Childs, received the inheritance of business expectations and corporate structures. Helen, however, received something both more durable and more nebulous: her father's absolute confidence and his entire priceless art collection. He began involving her in important meetings at a very young age. Sessions with architects, dealers, and financial advisors regularly included the young daughter, who listened far more intently than she ever spoke. She accompanied him to New York as the grand townhouse at 1 East 70th Street was taking shape. The walls were measured carefully not only for paintings, but also for a very specific, controlled future. The house was designed to be public yet controlled, accessible yet firmly defined as Frick's house. In that intense environment, she was never simply a decorative daughter. Accounts from the period recall her confidently speaking up when she disliked a painting. She mastered provenances, prices, and the subtle social map traced by art ownership. Art for the Frick family was always much more than mere decoration. Each acquired work carried a powerful message of cultivation, stability, and endurance beyond the roughness of strikes and steelmaking. Within this father-daughter axis, an unspoken but powerful agreement seems to have formed. Helen's life would be entirely given over to the maintenance of his legacy. In return, her financial security and social status would be made absolutely secure. This commitment took institutional form in Henry's last will and testament. He left Helen a major inheritance in cash and securities. Crucially, he structured his properties and art collection in a way that placed her centrally in their future governance. The New York house and collection were destined to become a public museum, but only under restrictive conditions that kept the family's dignity and memory intact. In Pittsburgh, Clayton remained part of a larger estate that symbolized industrial conquest and philanthropic obligation in equal measure. The will did not overtly dictate her marriage prospects, yet society fully expected an heiress of this magnitude to marry well. No marriage ever came. Contemporaries and biographers suggested an unspoken or perhaps internalized ban on romance. The understanding was that any union would immediately complicate the essential control over the vast fortune and the collection. Whether that prohibition originated with her father, her own character, or a combination of both, the result was clear. She remained permanently unmarried, bound not to a husband, but instead to an all-consuming memory. Adelaide's role during these formative years only intensified this pattern of single-minded focus. Her ongoing chronic illness and emotional distance left very little space for the traditional mother-daughter dynamic. There was no training for marriage, no correction, and no guidance from a maternal figure. Instead, Adelaide hovered on the periphery of important family scenes, present in name, but rarely in functioning authority. While her name sometimes appeared on social rosters, committee leadership and driving initiative always came from others. When Helen became a debutante, the family leveraged the occasion not just to launch a marriage candidate, but to cement their civic standing. Public gifts to the city, including land that would eventually become Frick Park, marked her formal social entry. A private milestone was merged seamlessly with public philanthropy. The powerful message was simple. This particular daughter might not marry a foreign duke, but the entire city would benefit from her focused presence. Within Pittsburgh society, the Fricks occupied a unique and somewhat awkward position. They commanded enormous national visibility and colossal wealth. At the same time, Henry's difficult reputation as a tough employer and the deep labour conflict meant they were not universally adored like some of their contemporaries. Adelaide's limited public role meant there was no equivalent of a Caroline Astor ruling their social calendar. Helen grew up in a house that was grand and powerful, but never the warm, unquestioned social centre of the city. This distinctive combination, wealth without easy adoration, power without a warm social matriarch, only reinforced her orientation toward institutions rather than parties. Where other heiresses of her class might have focused their energy on balls and strategic marriages, Helen focused intently on parks, museums and libraries. The most concrete evidence of Helen Clay Frick's distinctive path emerges clearly after her father's death in 1919. Henry left his properties, the New York house, and the entire fortune arranged for a very specific future. His wife and children were financially protected, but the true, unmistakable guardian of his posthumous identity was Helen. She began shaping that identity almost immediately through concrete, strategic acts. In 1920, she founded the Frick Art Reference Library in New York City. It initially began as a private tool to support scholarly research on her family's collection and related European painting. Under her focused direction, it quickly grew into an extraordinary archive, documenting Western art with photographs, documentation, and deep scholarship. Its systems of acquisitions, classification, and cataloguing all served a double function. They supported serious international scholarship while simultaneously reinforcing the Frick name as informed, serious, and central to the history of collecting. This effort was more than mere vanity. For generations of art scholars, the library became an absolutely essential resource. For the family, it provided a clear message. Frick money did not only buy world-class paintings, it also built the critical infrastructure that allowed others to study them systematically. Her influence over the Frick collection itself remained persistent and often fierce. Although the museum formally opened to the public in 1935, years after her father's passing, she maintained an intense interest in its day-to-day governance. She expected the trustees and directors to respect not only the literal letter of her father's wishes, but also their spirit, as only she understood it. Disputes with curators and museum directors often revolved around her control over interpretation. Her specific vision for the collection emphasized domestic scale, tranquility, and the preservation of the house's original atmosphere. Radical rehangs or massive expansion held no appeal for her. For Helen, the building functioned as a kind of modern reliquary for a very particular idea of her father's standing and taste. She demonstrated similar preservation patterns back in Pittsburgh. Clayton, the house of her deeply complicated childhood, remained intensely charged with her family's memory. She supervised preservation efforts and later supported the creation of the Frick Pittsburgh. This became a campus of museum spaces, educational programs, and gardens centered on the estate grounds. Financially, her skill was undeniable. Through astute investments, careful management, and strategic sales, she not only preserved the initial capital but substantially increased it. Art dealing was a part of this strategy. She traded certain works, including Impressionist paintings, at a time when their price peaks were still decades away. In this precise financial move, she mirrored other Gilded Age daughters and widows. They used art as a flexible, high-value asset class while simultaneously presenting themselves as dignified guardians of high culture. Her philanthropic choices further revealed her intense mission and aesthetic code. She supported cultural organizations, schools, and libraries, especially those that aligned with her strict sense of moral propriety and family memory. Support almost always came with conditions, ensuring that the Frick name remained visible and associated with her specific aesthetic and moral principles. At times, her passionate defense of that code became intensely combative. She actively resisted certain modernist tendencies in scholarship and art. She strongly opposed changes in museum policy that she believed diluted the original vision. Correspondents and observers consistently described her as formidable, opinionated, and sometimes difficult in the boardrooms she commanded. These pervasive conflicts illuminate the unusual structural position she occupied. She was a woman with immense personal resources, no children, no husband, and a name that served equally as an obligation and as currency. Her vast authority did not emerge from formal corporate titles or elected roles. It arose from the potent intersection of patronage, inheritance, and carefully guarded personal archives. Seen across multiple decades, the patterns in Helen Clay Frick's life align with larger systems of American dynastic wealth. They also show distinctive, powerful variations. One central mechanism across dynasties was the use of an unmarried daughter as a steadfast guardian of memory. In most families, the sons carried the business interests forward. The daughters married into rival clans, which naturally diffused both alliances and capital. In the Frick family, Childs represented the business line. Helen instead became the powerful custodian of the family narrative. Her power rested on legal facts, her trusteeships, and her massive inheritance. Yet it also relied on less visible structures. These included years of intimate familiarity with the collection's history, her control over personal archives, and the immense moral authority derived from a lifetime of fierce loyalty to her father's public image. Trustees and curators who dealt with her confronted not merely a donor's descendant, but a person who had actually sat in the room when all the key founding decisions were made. In her hands, memory functioned as yet another strategically deployed asset. She maintained absolute control over access and interpretation. This pattern connects to a broader architecture of dynastic wealth. Gilded Age fortunes routinely translated raw industrial profits into refined cultural capital. Parks, libraries, museums, and mansions provided enduring influence and much-needed reputational repair. Frick Park in Pittsburgh the Frick Collection and the Frick Pittsburgh collectively form an enduring network of spaces. The family name persists in these places long after the steel mills themselves finally closed. Within this cultural network, female figures consistently played essential curatorial roles. Bertha Palmer in Chicago strategically used art and grand hospitality to redefine Midwestern status. Arabella Huntington expertly shaped the collections that created the Huntington Library and Art Museum in California. Helen Clay Frick belongs squarely in that significant lineage. These were women who did not always control railroads or factories directly, but who designed the enduring cultural structures that fix their families permanently in the national memory. The mother-daughter relationship in the Frick household added a specific layer of emotional complexity. Adelaide's severe depression and emotional withdrawal, intensified by child loss and the violence of the Homestead strike, left Helen without the conventional mentoring that structured many upper-class girls' lives. There were no elaborate letters explaining marriage strategies, no detailed training for formal presentation, and no Newport campaigns to secure titled European husbands. Instead, the profound maternal absence produced a very different kind of inheritance. Helen stepped directly into companionship with her dominant father. The immense emotional labour normally divided among a spouse and grown children compressed onto a single teenage daughter. She listened to business stories, accompanied him on trips to view art, and shared the overwhelming silence of rooms perpetually haunted by dead siblings. This substitution came with significant gains and costs. On one hand, it prematurely broadened her exposure to sophisticated adult concerns. On the other, it severely limited her romantic possibilities. Critically, it granted her unusually direct access to influence and information typically reserved exclusively for male deputies or sons. Sister dynamics in her specific case were defined not by any form of rivalry, but by a devastating absence. The sister who might have been a competitor, a confidant, or a necessary foil died tragically in childhood. The lost brothers also removed other potential companions and possible heirs. In many old money stories, a beautiful sister and a plain sister might receive different dowries and fates. In this family, fate simply removed the usual cast entirely. Helen remained alone at the centre, the sole surviving daughter who carried both the enormous expectations and the chronic grief. Her later life demonstrated a form of deep resilience that fits a broader pattern among women of her economic class. Tragedy did not soften her personality into any form of public sentimentality. Instead, it hardened her character into a disciplined, lifelong program. Build institutions, control the reputation, and hold the line against any reinterpretation that felt disloyal. At the same time, her meticulously built institutions produced genuine, lasting cultural value. The Frick Art Reference Library, in particular, became an absolutely foundational tool for the discipline of art history. Scholars from around the world consulted its unique files. Students learned to view paintings not merely as beautiful objects, but as items with documented provenance, scholarly debates, and complex exhibition histories. The Frick collection offered a specific, carefully preserved experience of domestic grandeur, distinct from the largest encyclopedic museums. This duality, culture and conflict, beauty and immense cost, is characteristic of many Gilded Age legacies. The money that funded these vast, beautiful institutions came from industries linked to the fierce suppression of labour, dangerous working conditions, and exploitation. Yet, the institutions themselves offered learning, art, and public gardens. Both complex truths remain permanently standing. The last decades of Helen Clay Frick's life unfolded in a long arc of continuity, discipline, and gradual withdrawal. She successfully outlived her mother, her father, her siblings, and most of her contemporaries in the collecting world. She saw the Frick collection in New York established as a famous landmark. She watched Pittsburgh reinvent itself as a city of culture and universities rather than smoke and steel. While her involvement in daily operations naturally diminished with age, her formidable presence was continuously felt. Institutional rituals, naming conventions, and policy choices carried her specific imprint. Staff understood they were not merely working for a park or a museum. They were diligently maintaining a particular family narrative anchored in her father's successful rise and her own lifelong determination. Financially, she continued to support only those causes that fit her specific sense of obligation and refined taste. Some gifts focused on cultural education and art. Others reflected long-standing personal loyalties and commitments. In every case, the underlying quiet principle remained. She used her vast wealth to reinforce and stabilize structures that preserved taste, refined memory, and supported community. Her death in 1984, at the age of 96, marked the final close of a remarkable span of American history. Born deep in the Victorian era, she lived through the Great Depression, 2 World Wars, the Progressive Era, and the rise of modern museum culture. Her lifetime witnessed both the peak and the eventual decline of the classic industrial dynasty. The estate she left was numerically smaller than the earlier headline sums. It had been reduced by decades of dedicated philanthropy, institutional investments, and the natural erosion of fortune over time. Yet the true measure of her legacy was never determined by a single dollar figure. It lay instead in the stable, enduring existence of multiple institutions: the Frick Art Reference Library, the Frick Collection, the Frick Pittsburgh, and the permanent presence of Frick Park in the city landscape stand as her monuments. Taken together, these enduring spaces tell a story not just about a single industrial magnate, but about a daughter who chose to bind her own life entirely to the management of his memory. Helen Clay Frick's story greatly complicates simple narratives that describe old money women as merely decorative hostesses or passive financial beneficiaries. She neither founded a separate dynasty through children nor married into a European title. Her specific power was exercised through litigation when necessary, through curation, and through the patient, strategic shaping of institutions across more than 6 decades. Her life demonstrates one of the quieter but more enduring ways women in dynastic families have successfully wielded immense power. It was exercised not always from the head table at a glittering ball, nor through a famous or strategic marriage. Her true authority came from the guarded study, the archive, and the boardrooms where names on plaques were chosen with infinite care and paintings were hung just so. In that sense, the daughter of the Steel Baron ultimately became something else by the end of her very long life. She became a kind of private, powerful historian of her own class. She was determined that the version of events attached to the Frick name would be the one printed in catalogues, written in stone, and taught within galleries. The institutions that bear her name stand today as both question and testament. They are beautiful rooms filled with art that invite profound admiration, and they are quiet reminders of the complex machinery of loyalty, grief, and immense wealth that was required to build them.